Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laiq Sevighi, the father of HOLOPHASE. Part 17. Not a substance or field. Nothing's stuff. There is one primitive, phi, the holophase, a continuous cyclic order that makes reality readable. When phi becomes readable as change, its first differential phase appears, and with it, three inseparable readouts arrive together. The temporal dimension omega, omega, the spatial dimension kappa, kappa, and the kinematic dimension nu, nu, woven from the first two. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts these three shadows together. What we call worlds, objects, forces, histories, and minds are stable, licensed patterns inside this derivative language. The formal mathematical work behind these ideas can be found on Zenodo by searching holophase. We did not begin from space or time, and we did not begin from matter or energy. We began from what makes anything readable at all. Phi was introduced as the primitive, and energy was reframed as tally, not substance, because numbers are not stuff, and measurements are not miracles. Reality requires licensing and coherence, and claims must carry prediction and falsification, or they are only poetry. Episode 12 installed the epistemic firewall as the discipline that stops narrative drift, so that even our most beautiful sentences remain accountable. Now in episode 13, we move with two movements that must not be reversed. First, we earn the permission layer, undifferentiated phi. Phi before any readable change has become public and certified. Then we earn the public layer, differentiated phi. Phi once change becomes readable under licensing, once omega and kappa and nu show themselves as readouts, once topology and tallies become lawful, once persistence and memory become possible. The first must come before the second, because if we rush to the second, we will confuse the first visible shadows for the source of visibility itself, and we will build a universe out of borrowed assumptions. So hold a compact picture of this whole episode while we speak. Anchor A is the silent ground. What phi is, what it is not, and why comparability must be earned before anything can be compared. Anchor B is the sounding world. How change becomes public, how readouts appear, how stable structure and lawful counting arise, and how the firewall governs every claim. We are now focusing on part 17 inside this larger arc, and we are still in Anchor A. We are still earning permissions. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives here, treat it as an error. Good. Part 16 took us through a threshold that many people spend a lifetime circling without crossing. We earned the permission that phi is neither mental nor physical. It comes before that split. It is the common ground from which both sides of that ancient argument can later emerge as different kinds of stabilized pattern with different kinds of persistence and accessibility. And the moment we earn that permission, another question arrives, almost automatically, like a reflex that lives deep inside the human mind. If phi is so fundamental, then what is phi made of? It is an innocent question, and it is also a trap. Because the mind has been trained by survival, by craft, by building, by breaking, by eating, by being bitten, to believe that every real thing must be stuff, that every real thing must be made of something else. And if we keep digging, eventually we will hit the final brick, the last ingredient, the ultimate substance. So the mind tries to treat phi like a hidden material, a secret fluid, a field, a medium, something with an amount, with a density, with a place where it is. Part 17 is where we refuse that reflex, not as a philosophical preference, but as a firewall requirement. If we let stuff thinking into the silent ground, it will quietly import everything we promised not to import. It will sneak in containers. It will sneak in locations. It will sneak in amounts and flows. It will sneak in dynamics. It will give us an apparent foundation that is actually a smuggled world. So here's the core claim of Part 17, stated plainly. Phi is not made of anything. Phi is not a substance. Phi is not a field. Phi is not stuff in any sense that would make the question, what is it made of, meaningful. Let me say that again in even simpler words. Phi is not the kind of thing that can be made of something else. Phi is what makes made of meaningful later. If you ask what phi is made of, you are making a category mistake. You are trying to measure the ruler with the ruler before the ruler exists. You are trying to ask for ingredients before ingredient has any licensed meaning. And this matters. It matters because if we miss this, the holophase stance collapses into the very style of explanation we are refusing. A world of hidden substances carrying other substances forever. It becomes an infinite regress with better costumes. Now I want to make this feel concrete without breaking the one rule that keeps audio clear. We will use one everyday analogy, and we will not stack another on top of it. So let us take one object you already understand. A chess game. Not the wooden board, not the carved pieces, the game. When you say chess, what you really mean is not the material, because chess survives when the pieces change. You can play chess with plastic, with stone, with coins, with drawings on paper, even in your head. The pieces can be replaced completely, and chess remains chess. So where is chess? If you go looking for chess inside the wood grain of a pawn, you will never find it. If you put the pieces under a microscope, you will not discover checkmate atoms. If you burn the board, you have not burned the game itself. You have destroyed one physical instance, but the game persists as a structure that can be reinstantiated. Chess, at its core, is a set of constraints. What counts as a move, what counts as illegal, what counts as victory, what counts as the same position, what counts as repetition. It is not stuff. It is not made of marble. It is not made of electricity. It is not made of wood. It is a grammar that makes certain sequences meaningful and others meaningless. Now listen carefully, because here is the exact point we need. If someone insisted, but the rules must be made of something, what would you say? You could say, the rules are written in a book. But ink is not the rule. Ink is a carrier. The same rule can be written in another language, another book, another medium. The rule survives the change of carrier. You could say the rules are in people's minds, but brains are not the rule. Brains are one place the rule can be encoded. The rule can be held in many minds and survive when one mind forgets. The rule is not identical to any particular brain state. You could say the rules are in a computer that runs chess, but silicon is not the rule. The rule can be compiled, translated, moved, copied, simulated. The rule is not the substrate. So the honest conclusion is simple. The rules are not made of a material. They are a relational structure that can be carried by many materials, but is not identical to any of them. Hold that feeling, because that feeling is the permission of Part 17. Phi is not the pieces of reality. Phi is not the board of reality. Phi is closer to the condition that makes game, piece, move, legal, illegal, same, and different meaningful at all. And even when I say closer to, I am still pointing with imperfect language. because in the silent ground, we are not yet allowed to treat phi as a thing among things, not even as a rulebook object sitting somewhere. We are earning a stricter claim. Phi is primitive comparability. It is the possibility of distinction. It is the precondition of saying this rather than that. Now, why does this matter so much? Because almost every modern intuition about foundations assumes that the deepest layer will be a smallest object, a tiny brick, a fundamental particle, a vibrating string, a field, a foam, a substrate, something that exists the way a rock exists, only smaller and more hidden. But if you accept phi as primitive, and if you accept the previous permissions, especially that only differences speak and absolute phi is unobservable, then substance thinking starts to self-destruct. A substance is something you can, in principle, talk about having an amount. More of it here, less of it there. A substance invites the language of location, distribution, density, and transport. Even if you try to be abstract, the concept of substance drags those assumptions behind it like a shadow you cannot detach. And what do those assumptions require? They require a container, even if you refuse to call it space. They require a notion of here and there, even if you refuse to call it distance. They require a notion of before and after, even if you refuse to call it time. They require intrinsic dynamics to explain change in amount, even if you refuse to call it motion. So the moment you call phi a substance, you have smuggled in the world we promised not to begin with. This is the first reason Part 17 matters. It protects the beginning. It prevents a fake foundation. It stops the reflex that turns every deep principle into a hidden material. There is a second reason it matters, and this one is just as important. Substance thinking creates infinite regress. If phi is a field, you will ask, what is the field made of? If the field is fundamental, you will still have the question, because fundamental is not an answer to made of. It is a label that says stop asking, but does not justify the stopping. If phi is a particle, you will ask, what are particles made of? If you say they are point-like, you have not answered made of. You have just declared the question forbidden. And the forbidden question will return somewhere else. What makes point-likeness meaningful? What makes identity meaningful? What makes countable units meaningful? If phi has intrinsic properties, absolute properties, you will ask how they can be measured. And we have already earned that absolutes are unobservable and measurement is relational. So the model will either contradict itself or quietly reintroduce hidden reference frames to make absolutes measurable. So part 17 is a refusal that saves coherence. We stop the regress not by finding the last brick, but by realizing that the deepest layer is not a brick at all. It is what makes bricks possible. Now let me tie this back to the chess analogy in the most disciplined way. If you misunderstand chess and treat the rules as a hidden material inside the pieces, you will create confusion without end. You will ask which piece contains the rule for the knight. You will try to locate legality inside wood. You will measure the weight of checkmate. You will do serious work and get nonsense results. Likewise, if you misunderstand phi and treat it as hidden stuff, you will try to locate phi in places, you will try to measure its amount, you will try to explain its motion, and every step will force you to import containers, dynamics, and absolute quantities that the firewall rejects. So the correct stance is this. Phi is a primitive of structure, not an ingredient. Phi is a primitive of comparability, not a material. Phi is a condition of meaning, not a thing that carries meaning like a bucket carries water. Now, we should not let this remain airy. The firewall demands prediction and falsification, not just elegant words. So what do we predict if part 17 is true? Here is a prediction you can understand in HOLOPHASE native terms, and that could be checked in principle once we enter differentiated phi and start building certified measurement. If phi is not stuff, then every operational handle we ever have on phi must come through license comparisons, not through measuring an intrinsic amount. That means any successful instrument, any certified window, will never return how much phi is here. It will only return comparative tallies, how phi varies across the window, how differences cohere, how patterns repeat, how relations persist. And when the instrument appears to give an absolute reading, we will always be able to rewrite that reading as a relational count against a standard that itself is a phi pattern. So the operational signature will be consistent. All stable readouts reduce to differences in phi and to coherence license tallies of those differences. No measurement ever requires a postulated phi substance with a density in a container. And if we try to build a theory in the wrong direction, if we force phi into the role of a field with values at points, the mathematics will immediately sprout gauge ambiguity and unverifiable constants, because the value at a point is precisely the kind of absolute that cannot be licensed without extra structure. So the prediction has two phases. First, in the correct holophase pipeline, the observables will be relational invariants built from differences and their coherence, and those invariants will be the only things that survive duplication by independent reconstructions. Second, in the incorrect pipeline, treating phi as stuff, the theory will demand unearned absolutes and will either become non-falsifiable or will break under its own contradictions. Now let me state the falsification condition with equal clarity, because a claim that cannot die is not a scientific claim, it is a belief. If someone constructs a complete, internally consistent, firewall-respecting foundation in which phi is a substance or field, with intrinsic, absolute properties that can be operationally measured in a way that does not reduce to relational comparison, then this claim fails. I will say it in the strict if X happens, this claim fails form. If phi can be treated as a substance with measurable absolute properties, measurable in a way that is independently verifiable without importing pre-existing containers, without importing absolute reference frames, and without collapsing back into relational tallies, then part 17 fails. That is a hard falsification, and it is meant to be. Because our claim is not a stylistic preference. It is a structural necessity implied by the permissions we already earned, that absolutes are unobservable, that measurement is relational, and that undifferentiated phi comes before the public readouts that later look like time and space and matter. Now we must also be honest about scope and limits, or else we will accidentally claim more than we have licensed. Part 17 applies to undifferentiated phi, the silent ground. Here we are not yet describing what stuff becomes in the public layer. We are not yet allowed to say matter is X or fields are Y as primitives. In the public layer, things that behave like substances may emerge as stable phi patterns under licensing. That will be a later story. Here we are only denying that phi itself is one of those emergent things. We are also not yet allowed to give a full reconstruction protocol, because the protocol belongs to the differentiated half of episode 13, where windows, coherence thresholds, and public comparability become the main characters. In part 17, we are only earning a permission, that the foundation is not an ingredient, but a condition. And we are not assuming any conventional physics intuition to carry the argument. We are not saying, because modern physics uses gauge symmetry. We are saying something deeper and earlier. If the primitive is comparability, then treating it as stuff is a category error that forces you to smuggle in the very notions the primitive is supposed to generate. Now, an energy reminder belongs here, because stuff thinking and energy thinking are often the same reflex wearing different masks. In holophase native terms, energy is a tally we assign to certain stable patterns of readout, a way of counting what the readouts do under translation of our standards. Energy is not a substance sloshing around. Energy is not the answer to what is it made of. So if your mind tries to rescue substance thinking by saying, maybe phi is made of energy, that is exactly the mistake part 17 is preventing. A tally cannot be the material of the thing it counts. Counting sheep does not make sheep. The number on a scale is not the metal inside the weight. A conserved accounting is not a fluid. It is a relational invariant of the readout system. So in this part, energy remains in its proper place. Downstream, derived, certified by comparison, never primitive. Now let us return to our single analogy, chess, because it can carry one more layer without becoming decorative. Imagine you watch two grandmasters play. You notice something interesting. The same rule set allows infinitely many games, but only some games become memorable. Only some sequences become stable patterns in the history of chess. A famous opening, a classic sacrifice, a known endgame technique. Those are persistent structures inside the space of possible play. But they are not written into the rules. They are patterns that emerge when rules meet play, when constraints meet actualization, when possibility becomes a specific unfolding. That is exactly the bridge episode 13 is building. The silent ground is the rule permission layer. It tells you what kind of thing a readable universe can be, without telling you which specific universe will be told. And part 17 is sharpening that. The rule permission layer is not a material substrate. It is a condition for meaning, for legality, for comparability. It is what makes a move count as a move. When later, in the public layer, the universe begins to play, we will see stable patterns that look like objects and fields and laws and energies. But we will not mistake those for the primitive. We will treat them like openings and endgames in chess, stabilized patterns that live inside the deeper grammar. So, if you are listening and your mind keeps wanting to ask, but what is the universe really made of? I want you to hear the correction, gently but firmly. That question belongs to the public layer, where made of becomes meaningful because some patterns become stable enough to be treated as constituents. But the primitive is not a constituent. It is what makes constituency possible. Now, let me address a quiet fear that sometimes appears here, because it can make people reject the whole program without realizing why. If phi is not stuff, does that mean nothing is real? No. It means reality is not anchored in a hidden material. It is anchored in certified structure, in licensed comparability, in relations that can be made public, duplicated, and counted. Chess is real as a game, even though it is not made of wood. Money is real as an accounting system, even though value is not a chemical. A promise is real as a constraint on action, even though you cannot weigh it. These are real in the only sense that matters for a firewall science. They make a difference in what can be predicted and what can be falsified. Holophase is not saying only thoughts exist. It is not saying only matter exists. It is refusing the false choice by going earlier. It is saying that before either thought or matter, there is the condition that makes any distinction meaningful, and that condition is phi. And that is why part 17 is not a retreat into vagueness. It is a tightening of the foundation. It is the move that prevents us from building a tower on a word. Now let me give you the one sentence the listener can carry, because without a carry, a deep idea becomes fog. Phi is not the stuff of reality. Phi is what makes stuff a readable category. Hold that sentence, because it will protect you from countless confusions later. including confusions that appear dressed as mathematics. If you ever see someone claiming to have explained the universe by introducing a new substance, a new field, a new ether, a new medium, you can ask one clean firewall question. Does this model make any new, coherence-licensed relational prediction? Or is it just renaming the mystery and pushing it one layer down? And you can ask one more. Does it stop regress by becoming a condition? Or does it continue regress by being another ingredient? Now I will close with a calm transition, because part 17 is not the end of the silent ground. It is one more permission earned, one more trap disarmed. We have earned that phi is not a substance or field, and that the made of instinct cannot be trusted at the foundation. Next, we move toward the final hinge. How a non-stuff primitive can still yield a public world of stable carriers, certified comparisons, and lawful tallies once licensing begins to operate. And now, briefly and concisely, what we have woven in this part is this. We refuse the deepest reflex of substance thinking, show that asking what phi is made of is a category error, anchored the foundation in comparability rather than material, and laid down a hard prediction and a hard falsification so that the claim remains firewalled. We end here not with a new substance, but with a cleaner beginning. Always peace be upon you.